Thanks, Jerry, for a wonderful talk again. Open to questions.
When you talk about like trying to explain determinism to people, it's a bit more helpful to think of humans or life in general as just not any special kind of matter, like just a bunch of atoms and molecules which run on like very precise reactions. So it's more helpful to think of it that way, and people will understand it better if you explain it that way, because then they can see where quantum mechanics comes in.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you partly and partly I don't. I mean, remember when I said it has to be true? The first reason why determinism is true is because it has to be true because of the laws of physics. Because we are machines that are made out of meat. We are not the same thing as rocks, though, because we do have consciousness and we are alive, and that's somehow different from the way rocks are. Rocks don't even make the appearance of choices unless, for example, they choose to roll downhill or something like that. But believe me, telling somebody that you're just like a car made out of meat, and therefore you have to believe what I'm telling you, is not a really effective way of turning them into determinists very quickly, because people don't like to think of themselves that way. I mean, that's the reason why I think that giving a lecture like this is only a stimulus for people to think about things. And then the real deciding will be done later.
That's a presentation skill. Different presenter may have different, depending also on the audience, right?
Hello, sir. If you want to design an experiment in which we have to show that the free will doesn't exist, for particularly in case of human being, we can't isolate two people for checking their reaction against particular action. Then we can't isolate two people and giving them same set of circumstances. So how can a study can be designed to prove that free will doesn't actually exist?
So what you're saying is we can't do the controlled experiment of putting two people in identical circumstances and seeing if they behave the same way. Is that? Yeah, well, you're right. But I would claim that the evidence for determinism doesn't require that. That in fact, the point that he just made and the first point I made, which is that our brains are subject to the laws of physics, is enough. It should be enough to convince the scientifically minded person that we cannot freely decide to do A or B. So we don't really have to do the controlled experiment, because as far as we know, the laws of physics hold in this universe. They are deterministic. Even quantum mechanics is deterministic in some ways, and therefore our behaviors are deterministic, and we don't have to do the experiment. But then I described a number of experiments that support that notion, including the fact that we can predict what people are going to do before they make the decision consciously, which implies that what's happening in the computer here is below our level of consciousness, and that's what's doing the decision for us.
So somehow in your talk you didn't mention the concept of complexity, but seems that somehow the illusion of free will that we all have has something to do with the fact that it's not the basic laws of physics like quantum mechanics, but the laws of extremely complex systems, such as namely living organisms, which are so complex as to challenge the scientific idea of whether they can be determined, say, in the age of the universe. So the idea of, can we read actually all your molecules and atoms using can we scan everything that you are made up of in order to determine your state at this instant? Are we sure this can be done in less than the age of the universe? And if not, is it a scientifically meaningful question to say that in principle such a state is determined?
Yeah, is there a question? Or that's a comment rather than a question.
It's mostly a comment,
Okay.
but I think it raises the question that, because you several times said the laws of physics tell us
Yes.
this. And I think there's a growing consensus within physics that the laws of physics are not just the laws of electrons and quarks. There are also different laws which are chaotic, complex, not so well known actually today, but which set limits on what one can know.
Yeah, but there's my comment on that, and it's a good comment, is that the laws of complex systems still break down to accepting the laws of physics. So, for example, chaos theory, in which a very small perturbation causes an unpredictable result, is nevertheless purely deterministic. Okay, that if we absolutely knew the initial state of that to with infinite precision, then we could predict what happens. So I think your comment is actually conflating predictability with determinism. So that determinism holds, but we don't know enough, and we'll never know enough to be able to predict it. That doesn't mean that we have free will, however. But I'm not aware of any sort of complex system physics that is not deterministic at bottom. That if we had perfect knowledge of how things work, that we would be able to predict.
The question lies in the meaning of perfect knowledge.
Yeah, well, that's where quantum indeterminacy comes in. I'm told by Sean Carroll, who's a friend of mine, a physicist, that we basically understand enough about what happens on the macro level in our world to say that determinism really is true. But for physics, I'm not a physicist, so I just take people's words for it. But people always raise the chaos theory, which is also biological as well as physical, and saying, well, see, you can't predict what's going to happen. But chaos theory is completely deterministic. If you start at the exact same starting point, you always wind up with the same result. Yeah.
So you said that people don't have any choice over their actions. Now, I'd
Yeah.
be very interested to know your opinion about the mass shootings that take place in America. Mass shootings take place. We
Yeah.
recently saw in Las Vegas the deadliest mass shooting in American history.
Correct.
So we have seen this regularly in the past few years. So do you mean to say that the people who do this, you shoot people indiscriminately, they don't have any choice? They just just take a gun because they have guns easily available, and they just shoot people. How would you look at these people?
I look at them as I look at Anders Breivik, because that's exactly what that Norwegian guy did. He was a white supremacist. He took an automatic weapon. He went to a children's camp. What a horrible thing he did. He went to a children's camp and just walked around this island and shot kids. He was a mass murderer. What do you do? I mean, it's horrible. It violates our notion of any sort of decency. It seems moral, it seems evil. But I would maintain that, first of all, he had no choice about what he did, based on the principles that I elucidated. But then he still needs to be punished, because a guy like that is going to do it again if you let him out on the streets. So how do you punish somebody like Anders Breivik? I showed you how Norway punished him. They put him in a decent cell, but they put him there for at least 20 years. He gets rehabilitation. Every 5 years, he's evaluated. And at the end of 21 years, if he's deemed safe, he's let out. Now, that violates a lot of, some people say, well, why shouldn't he be killed, or why shouldn't he be put in prison forever? Well, first of all, it doesn't seem to be a deterrent. We know in America that the capital punishment and life without parole is not a deterrent. So you can't say, well, he needs to be an example for everybody else, because that doesn't work, and it's also much more expensive to kill somebody or keep them in jail without parole than it is to rehabilitate them. And second of all, if he can be rehabilitated, if somebody that does a mass shooting can be made into a human being that would never do that again, why shouldn't you let them go? The only reason to keep him in prison is if you have some kind of retributive view that he deserves to be there forever because of what he did. And that, to me, that makes no sense, because I think he could make a contribution to society if he was fully rehabilitated that he could not make when he was in prison. So I don't think, look, we need to think that these things are horrible, because they are horrible. Think of all the grieving families and the deaths that occurred because of him. But we can't let that dominate our brain to the extent that we start executing people or putting people in jails that are so horrible because we feel that they deserve that because they could have done otherwise. They could not have done otherwise. We need to think of people like criminals as if they were broken machines. And we need to either repair them, or if we can't repair them, we need to treat them as humanely as we can and not allow them to go insane in a prison like they do in the United States.
I think it's a fun point. Maybe you may not have noticed this. He kept using the word environment, right? In an environment of hatred, you actually see more such kind of things. So your determinism doesn't mean that it's only genes. He kept on saying environment.
I think I have one question, because just now he said environment will be different, but what about the genes? The philosophy of Hinduism, it's something, like what you did in the last life that comes in the reincarnation. Mm-hmm. So what's your thoughts about it? It's a philosophical metaphysics question.
Yeah, well, I reject that philosophy. I don't think there's any evidence for reincarnation whatsoever. It's just been made up. If there is any evidence for reincarnation, I'd be glad to hear it. So, but if it's just the genes, and besides, how can suppose I was a rat in my last life, and I was a really good rat, so I get to come back as a human being, and I do something bad, I still have no choice, in that case, but since I don't believe in that, I would just say you don't choose which genes you get either. It's a complete, it's deterministic on the level of meiosis and, assorted mating and who you mate with and stuff. But since you don't choose your genes and you don't choose your environment, then you're not responsible for the way you turn out. As for reincarnation, I'll let you fight it out with people that don't believe in reincarnation. Yeah.
So in the context of changing someone's mind or
Yes.
deterring someone from committing an act or even rehabilitating someone,
Yes.
the example that you gave of the dog that gets kicked repeatedly and therefore decides not to approach the person.
Yes.
So when you talk about predicting someone's actions, in this small example, which would have larger implications, could it be predicted that the person would kick the dog and therefore the dog would stop responding? Or at some point, does the prediction also change as the dog's brain gets reprogrammed? I didn't quite understand that.
Well, the whole thing is deterministic. In the sense that if you had complete knowledge of a person's propensity, whether or not the kind of person that was going to kick a dog, and that's determined by their genes and their environment, then you could predict they would kick the dog, and then you could predict from the dog what the dog would do. So the whole, it drives you nuts to try to think about this because it goes back way back before me, how this works or not. But
so the very fact that the brain would get reprogrammed from how it was earlier, even that could be predicted?
It's
you're
determined.
saying?
Yeah, I think what I'm saying is that everything is determined. But it's also true that you can change people, that the environments that people encounter can change their minds, and we can do this at the lab. Now we're determined to do this, but we could take a dog and put it in the lab and have somebody pet it, and it's going to turn out to be a nice dog. And we can be determined to put another dog or put the same dog in another room when they get kicked, and we can test out what the result is, and we will know from that, and we know from many, many pieces of evidence in science that what environment impinges upon you affects your behavior. Now that doesn't mean that those environments are not determined. I could be determined to do this experiment with the dog, but it does show that the environment does change the way we behave. And that's all I'm trying to say. That because some people that don't like determinism say that it means that everything is fated to happen no matter what environment somebody encounters. But when you start thinking about, well, am I determined to kick a dog, and what made me determined to kick a dog? Were my parents mean to me? And then why were my parents mean to me? Were their parents mean to them? It goes all the way back to the Big Bang, and you could drive yourself nuts thinking about that. I am a determinist, but I feel like I make decisions. I don't think it's possible for a human being to completely lose their sense of agency. I think it's so strongly ingrained in our brains that it's impossible to get rid of it. But nevertheless, I think on a scientific basis, we have to reject it on an intellectual basis. We don't have to start behaving like we're robots all the time, but there are certain fixes we could do in the criminal justice system. And whether or not these happen is determined, right? And maybe it's determined by you guys that will do this kind of stuff, and I was determined to tell you that, to change your mind. So it's a big regress. So.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is a continuation of this. Isn't it very contradictory? It's very difficult to believe that everything is predetermined, and yet we can influence something which is going to happen by changing the environment. So these two sentences in the same context, it's very difficult to understand. Either it is predetermined and it cannot be changed no matter what.
Correct.
So just let it happen, whatever is happening. So
Well, you don't let it,
because it's like you accept that it is determined and leave it. Why try to change, or why do anything at all? Why take any conscious decision? Because you may take some decision based on whatever has been determined, and things will go on. So the process of growth or thought is something very
I think I understood the question. I think what she's trying to maybe you have to give a very scientific clarification. What she's trying to say is, when you say determined, it's a mechanism of determination of a decision which is dependent on genes and environment. So when he said, what is to be changed, it's the environment, because genes you cannot change it because you're already born. Environment you can change, so accordingly you can change the decision. That's
you can change the environment.
Once you know the process of determined, then you can change it.
Yeah, Shoshi's right. The shorter answer I give is that we can change the environment, but we're determined to change the environment. If I want to do that experiment with the dog, well, that would have been done in advance, so there's no contradiction there at all. You can show by a scientific experiment that changing an environment will change people's behaviors and decisions, but the way you show that and the experiments you do to do that, and the Sarkisian experiment, those were determined in advance by the genes and the environment of those investigators. So I don't think there's a contradiction there. That's my view at any rate. So.
In 1995, Stephen Jay Gould reissued his book, The Mismeasure of Man, as a rejoinder to Marianne Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve, which was largely deterministic in its terms of how you're treating populations, right? In that book, he spoke about Cesare Lombardo's physiognomy chart, where you actually look at how you can tell who pickpockets are going to be, who thieves are going to be, who murderers are going to be, a 19th century depiction, which was widely used across the 19th century in order to detect various forms of criminals. Mm-hmm. Now, that particular diagram has since largely been debunked, but listening to your talk today, it seems as though that was just a simplistic view of a larger deterministic story that we can all at some level, if we have the right material, play Lombroso's in attempting to determine what someone might do if we had perfect knowledge.
Yeah.
Now there's something frightening about that, but I'm curious about that. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the subject, if that were actually true. Another point you made was this whole point of quantum tunneling, where you said that a change in electron might make you do something else. How is that then distinguishable from a point about free will? All you can say is, an electron did something.
There was a different decision.
Yeah, but how can you tell? And that is something which I would like to know.
Well, first of all, let me answer the second question. We can probably talk about the first one privately, but first of all, you can do calculations on whether or not quantum mechanical phenomenon could apply in human decision making. Is the fundamental indeterminacy of quantum mechanics apply on the level of brain activity? And I've been told it doesn't. So that's one way to approach the question. The other one is, if there's if an electron leaps, then you could have done otherwise. And by mentioning Gould, by the way, he's dead wrong on the contingency and the tape of life. Under my view, the tape of life would give identical results except for quantum indeterminacy, which might apply in mutation, for example. But if quantum indeterminacy does change your behavior, then you could not distinguish that from free will. But I would claim on first principles alone that we don't have free will because we cannot affect the movement of electrons in our brain. There is no known mechanism whereby there's something separate from the material processes of our brain that could influence the decisions that we make. So what I would ask you in return, Mo, are you a dualist? Do you believe?
No, I'm just barely responding.
No, but I'm asking you now.
Well, potentially, largely because I leave room for the possibilities of doubt. I don't think I'm going to be a determinist out and out, and it'll take me some time to think through your situation. For example, yes, for instance, one can also say, how do we look at the role of environment, right? How does environment change? Where do we put creativity in that story? How do you explain a yellow phase and a blue phase for a Picasso? Is it more about constraint based upon what you have rather than, for example, the possibility that we cannot be predators with wheels in the savannah simply because we don't have the genetic predisposition? So it's much more about constraint for me. So how would you respond to that? That would be my answer.
In a world where determinism is accepted and criminals are punished in the way you said, would the punishment for all crimes be the same? Basically,
no.
Everyone is put in a decent cell and released when they are believed to be socially safe.
Well, the punishment for all crimes would not be the same for three reasons. First of all, if we wouldn't want to execute people for running a stop sign in their car.
No, not execution, because you already said there
Sorry?
would be no. In a world where determinism is accepted, there would be no executions, right?
Yes, there were, okay, but I'm saying,
So-
well, for the three reasons that I gave you, and answer your question is no, the punishment would not be, well, first of all, the notion of punishment is not one we should use. We should use the idea of deterrence, rehabilitation, and sequestration. And since different crimes, for example, if you're a pedophile, if you prey sexually on small children, we know from psychologists that that's very, very hard to cure. So the treatment for that would probably be very different from somebody who runs a stop sign. And you know, society is going to function better if we treat these broken cars that are broken in different ways. So no, there's no reason that punishment should be the same for different crimes. You know, because rehabilitation, deterrence, and sequestration will differ depending on the nature of the crime and the person who commits the crime.
So you explained the experiment where you have flashed different screens and where subjects were asked to make a decision. So my question is this: if different people have make the decision, so you see this fMRI peak at different points of time. Maybe they have decided what to choose in the next frame. That has been made 4 seconds ago. That is the time of the decision when you see the peak. And you are saying no. I mean, it's already there, and that is a precursor of like you are not making the decision. The decision is already made, but it might be there before the frames come. Some people have already decided that okay, now next frame I'm coming, I'm going to subtract the thing because it's high frame rate, like 1 second or something like that. So my question is that whether two different person will have two different peaks at two different times. I mean, there might be have some different.
Yeah, but remember what the experiment was. We asked people at the moment where they made a decision to record that time. Now what you're telling me is they actually made that decision when they weren't conscious of it. Is that right? They made the decision 4 seconds in advance, but it didn't reach their consciousness until 4 seconds later. But that's exactly what I'm saying, that the decision is made not through your conscious thought, but somewhere pre-consciousness. And that's all it takes, you know. I mean, this is exactly what you'd predict if determinism
No, I agree on that it will be still deterministic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. So I'm not sure what your question is.
Okay, probably I got the answer.
Oh, okay. So. Oh, okay. I mean, but that's a common criticism of these experiments, that actually the decision was made beforehand and the person wasn't conscious of it. But then that just supports but that's more than that. It's the fact that it's predictable, you know, from your brain patterns alone, that you can tell what somebody's going to do, which is nobody would have thought that. And now that we have this data, people are doing everything they can to try to dismiss it, which shows you how deeply ingrained in our psyche the idea that we can really choose is, you know. And I feel it too. I feel like I'm going to get a drink of water right now. But that was probably decided a couple of hours ago before I did that.
Yeah. You said that the quantum level indeterminism may not matter in human decision making, which is fine. But there is a lot of stochasticity at cellular and molecular level as well.
Sorry, I can't. So
there is a lot of stochasticity at the molecular and cellular level as well. It doesn't have to be at the quantum level. So for example, in protein folding there is stochasticity, in chromosomal segregation there is stochasticity.
That's what you say, I don't believe you. I mean, I think what you're saying is we can't predict how a protein can fold. That doesn't say that if we had perfect knowledge of all the molecules and atoms. I mean, there's only one form of pure stochasticity in nature, and that is quantum indeterminacy. The rest of it is completely predictable from classical physics, but we can't predict it. So what you call stochasticity, I would say, is just imperfect knowledge. We can't predict how a protein is going to fold, but if we had all that knowledge, we could, because that's what science tells us, how the universe works, you know.
Okay.
So that would be my answer.
Yeah,
I mean, that's why Steve Gould was wrong when he said that if we ran the tape of life, stochasticity would ensure that we'd have a different outcome. Well, there is no stochasticity in the history of life. That asteroid that hit us, 60 million years ago wasn't an accident. It was determined by the laws of physics years before that. And so the only pure stochasticity in human life, I think, is mutations, which could be, and I'm not sure about that. But anyway, did you want to expand on your question? Or?
Yeah, I mean, if mutation, then there are somatic mutations as well. There are mitochondrial mutations in neurons which also change behavior.
Yes, but
So-
the question is, are those predictable? I mean, are those deterministic or not? Not that are predictable. We call mutations random phenomena, but that could just reflect our lack of understanding, that perhaps if we knew what was happening in a stretch of DNA and all the molecules around it and the perfect knowledge and the temperature and stuff like that, that we would be able to predict that there would be a mutation there. So I think it's wrong to call mutations stochastic phenomena. I think we need to be very careful when we use the word stochastic because it misleads people about things. It confuses predictability with determinism, I think. So.
Yeah. The other question, which is not completely new, someone asked something similar there. I'm extending that question, that unless we have something comparable to Turing test with which we can test or have some kind of demonstrability of free will, the debate looks more semantic.
It looks what?
More semantic.
Yeah, it is. Well, not about free will. The debate about compatibilism versus incompatibilism is a semantic
Yeah,
one.
but even at other levels,
Yes.
unless we have something similar to Turing test, it looks more a semantic debate.
Well, I mean, I think my first point was that it was not semantic in the sense, excuse me, this is why I need water, right? Because I was determined to cough. You don't have to get me water. It's not semantic in the sense that if you are a true scientist and you accept the laws of physics, and most physicists accept the laws of physics, and that there are no exceptions we know of, then our brain has to operate according to the laws of physics, and therefore what we do is determined. We cannot have chosen otherwise given the same molecular configuration, and I don't think that's a semantic issue. That's a real issue of scientific truth, or not.
Can I
Yeah.
I also think that there is a lot of confusion about this is when you use the word I and we. Who is that I and we? That I and we is born 7 seconds after you have done something.
Yes.
That so-called conscious self itself, for each event or each action, the conscious self is few seconds later.
Yes.
So that I think that is clarified. I guess much of confusion is over.
Yeah. So
Because
sorry.
you keep saying that I didn't take a decision.
Yeah,
I didn't do
I
this.
understand.
Who is that I?
Yeah,
That I itself is not born until that the action is
Yeah,
over.
I understand what you're saying. Yes, he's right. Using the word I is also confusing because there's a whole philosophical and scientific literature about the fact that what does I mean? Well, I will say I is this entity standing before you, this individual member of Homo sapiens that's identified as Jerry Coyne, but there is no I in the brain that you can identify as a person, as a personality or a characteristic. So, I'll be a little bit more careful about that in the future. Yeah.
Is it possible for us to know which living organisms have the sense of agency? And if that is possible, which were the first organisms to have that sense?
I can't answer the second part of your question. The first part of the question is done. There's an experiment called the mirror test that you may know of, where you take an animal and you want to see if it knows that it recognizes itself as an individual. And so what you do is you put a dot on its head or some marker on its forehead and you put it in front of a mirror. And then if that animal looks in the mirror and sees that and goes for its own head as opposed to what's in the mirror, then that's thought. I mean, I can't prove this because we cannot get into the consciousness of an animal, but that's thought to reflect the fact that an animal that does this, that passes the mirror test, has some sense of itself as a conscious individual, that's me, and that's not another elephant in the mirror. And the animals that can do that are primates, elephants, some animals like cats, for example, well, you can't train them very well. But in terms of what is the so-called most primitive animal that can pass that test, I don't really know. But that data is surely going to be in some textbook somewhere. But again, this is only an approximation to getting inside the consciousness of another individual, and we don't know. I mean, And another question, people that do say that we have free will, like a lot of religious people do, if you ask them, okay, well, does your dog have free will? Does your cat have free will? Does an ape have free will? And they get very, very confused when you ask them that question. And many of them will just say, no, you do, because it's something that's given to you by God. But that means that an ape cannot choose whether it eats a banana or an apple or anything like that. Other animals are determined, but we're not. And that's an even more problematic scientific hypothesis, because after all, we're descended from each other. So yeah.
Just a sec.
Yeah.
Could we determine how the...
Well, you're in charge, so you okay.
My question is that as you showed that there is a difference of outcome in the Scandinavian model of criminal system and the US model or the
Yes.
Indian system.
Yes.
So if we change the environment, we can move towards a better society. I'm looking towards the environmental end because, as we have frequently written about, that consequence is the only way, the deterrent way, the meaningful way as a deterrent to stop something or to change behavior. But the other thing is, take example of Holocaust museums. One who goes there, I have been there, a person changes. That theme of never again. So as you said, that your lecture can change us.
Yeah.
In that way, I think that moving towards a better society is very important. I'm also a determinist like you.
Yes.
But with this new context, that message should also go.
Yeah, I thought it was implicit in what I said, but maybe not, because what I talked about was changing the prison system and not the society as a whole. And, the reason I did that is because it's a lot easier to change the judicial system than it is to change society as a whole. But ultimately, of course, you want to create a society in which in the US, for example, we want to get rid of guns. I mean, we have a horrible gun laws where anybody can get an assault weapon if they want. I could do it myself if I wanted. So we obviously, by changing that will change the incidence of criminal behavior, and it's a choice we make. But that's a much harder thing to do than simply change the prison system. Or stopping executions. I mean, that's an easy thing to do. All the Supreme Court of India or the United States has to do is say, okay, capital punishment is cruel and unusual, we don't do it anymore. I mean, that alone, because, in the United States, many, many innocent people are executed. That's another reason why we shouldn't kill people, besides it's retributive, is that once you kill somebody, and then they can never bring them back again. So I think, there can be quick fixes in the judicial system that will be enormously useful. But ultimately, yes, we have to change society in a way that, is consistent with determinism, but also consistent with our liberal principles.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
So, given the fact that all the atoms are identical, let's say a hydrogen atom from one person is identical to an hydrogen atom from another person.
Well, they're not, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll ask the question, like, let's say a situation where I have identical biological twins and I raise them in the same environment, and given a test, is there a higher probability that both of them will decide the same?
You're talking about atoms or genes or... Well, genes are made of atoms, and
Yeah.
so the answer to that is yes. And we know that because of studies on identical twins, because they have identical genes and they have identical environments. Or you can take identical twins and separate them at birth, so they have identical genes but different environments. But if you test them, they always behave much more similarly than either two random people or fraternal twins. I mean, that alone shows that genes play a large part. I mean, they'll smoke the same brand of cigarettes very often. I mean, it's amazing the similarity of these people, and it shows something about the genetic determinism of our behavior, that you can get this kind of replicability. So,
I think one last question over there.
Yes.
That boy. I'm sorry, there are so many questions still.
Oh, there always is in this talk. So.
Does circadian rhythm play any role in the decisions that we make? Circadian rhythm, biological clock.
Sorry, could you?
Circadian rhythm, biological clocks.
What about it?
Do they also influence your decisions?
Oh, yeah, sure they would. I mean, when you're tired, you do things differently from when you're awake. So, I mean, circadian rhythms are just part of the environment that affects your genes, and they reprogram your brain and your body as well. And so, yeah, it will affect your behavior. Everybody knows that you will behave stupidly if you're jet lagged. I mean, I've been doing it for 3 or 4 days, so I know that that's true. So there are many environmental factors that will condition our behavior. So.
Yeah, I think we had to really stop this. For many people have more questions, I suppose. Thanks again, Jerry, for a wonderful talk and all the questions. And